Questioning. Thank you, Chairman Hurd, from the great state of Iowa. Welcome to the panelists today. I think it was a couple weeks ago in our IT subcommittee hearing, we had the Social Security Administration sitting in your seats. In my questioning of them, we stumbled upon the fact that in 2006, they undertook a massive IT project that lasted 7 years to around 2013, 2014. And the end result was it was scrapped. So I asked how much was spent. The answer was $340 million was wasted on that IT project in the Social Security Administration. I posted that in social media, and I can't repeat some of the comments that I have received from the people in the 1st District of Iowa about wasting $340 million of the taxpayers' money. The largest city in my district, Cedar Rapids, Iowa, they've had 2 500-year floods in the last 8 years. They need $85 million for a flood wall. We wasted 4 times that, 4 flood walls in the Social Security Administration on a scrapped IT project. To add insult to injury, I asked, was the vendor paid, Lockheed Martin? They were paid. I asked, was the CEO terminated? He was reassigned, of course. So incremental software development makes a tremendous amount of sense to me. And this question is for Mr. Powner, Mr. McCormick, and Mr. Wiggins. Is incremental software development, A, is it working? And B, what are the challenges to implementing it? Mr. Powner first.
I think clearly when you look at the historical nature of incremental development, we did a report a few years ago on successful IT acquisitions. There were 7 that agencies pointed to that were a success story, deployed somewhere within cost and schedule, users like this system. Every one of them was an increment of a larger development effort. So I think when you look at incremental development, there's no argument that's the right way to go. Agile development, incremental, we need to continue to go down that path. I think we need to look real hard about funding projects that you can't deliver something within that budget year. OMB has a 6-month requirement on incremental development, but if you can't deliver something within the budget year, we ought to think real hard about whether we ought to be throwing money at it.
Mr. McCormick.
Thank you for the question. If I could rewind and indulge me for just a moment on the reporting relationship situation. I've been a CIO of an operating component. I've been a CIO at Department of Justice, and now the CIO at Department of Homeland Security, and the Vice Chair of the Executive Council. And I will tell you, the #1 thing, in my opinion, that makes us successful is what I call goal congruence and a governance structure at the department.
Could you say that? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear what you just said.
Goal congruence, and I'll explain that in a minute, and a governance structure. Every CXO in the Department of Homeland Security has the authority to sort of throw the flag in and say, I've got a problem with that project. And when I say CXOs, I'm talking about the Chief Procurement Officer, the Chief Human Capital Officer, certainly myself. All of us together as a sort of a board of directors have that authority. In regards to the agile development, and this is where the goal congruence comes into play, it works, right? It's a private sector best practice. If you go out and look at any advanced private sector company that uses IT as a strategic weapon, I'll call it, they're all developing in this kind of a process. But you cannot do that unless you have the right skills, which means you need your CHICOs to help you hire those folks. So you cannot do that unless you have the right procurements in place, right? I talked about Flash and ECS, which is our cloud-based technology services, and our agile software development capability, right? That's our Chief Procurement Officer. If they're not completely aligned with your movement, so to speak, none of this happens. And so all those folks typically report into, a lot of times it's not the Deputy Secretary, it's the Undersecretary of Management. And that's what's really important. So if you're going to sort of move the ball forward on whether it's security with FISMA whether it's your digital transformation effort, whether it's FITARA. You need to make sure that the folks that are reporting to that individual are on board, and particularly that person is on board. I think that
Are there documents signed off to make sure those parties, are there documents that are physically signed off on to make sure the physical parties you just mentioned are on board, so the goals are congruent?
Absolutely.
In the private sector, we sign off on design
We have elements
docs.
in their performance plans in regards to the governance process. Every single gate review gets certified and codified in writing and cannot go through that process, and has to be approved by every one of those members in our acquisition review board going forward. That's that governance structure I was talking about. Every one of those CXOs are sort of board of directors of that governance structure. It's run by, in this particular case, the Undersecretary of Management. But I think it's just, I just wanted to point that out. That I think it's very important. While you can have the CIO report to the Deputy Secretary, which is important and could be powerful, if they're not associated to the individual that you're reporting to, then you're still in a negotiation, right? You're constantly negotiating. If that individual's on board and that individual says, hey, we're going to move, then we're going to move, right? And so that's just something that I would think this group ought to think about and consider.
Mr. Chairman, can Mr. Wiggins answer my question? Thank you. Mr. Wiggins?
Thank you for the time to answer. I just want to echo both Mr. McCormick's comments and also Mr. Pownder's in getting to an earlier point. As the only CIO at the Department of State, I have the ability, as the authorizing official, to approve IT projects and kill IT projects. We have a governance structure in place that's pretty comprehensive. We have an eGov program board that meets on a quarterly basis, an eGov advisory board that meets on a monthly basis. We also have a new cloud computing governance board that started in May to review ongoing cloud efforts. The governance structure is extremely important, and as I mentioned earlier when I was responding to Congressman Connolly, we've now added that incremental development into the baseline change request for all IT projects going forward. We also have something called Managing State Projects for IT, MSP-IT, that has control gates, and there's a review process. Not only do you have to have a sponsor for your project, but it goes through a regular control gate, and Agile development is a part of that. There are two challenges I see with Agile development. Number one, it's the user interface and the user experience has to be built into it. So we have what are called UX expertise that we've gone from U.S. Digital Services to help in that whole usability phase of it, and also for that Agile loopback. And the other thing I would say that is a challenge is that when in our case, we use a firm fixed price contract. And when you start to look at Agile, oftentimes when you say to a developer who's oftentimes a contractor, okay, I now want you to go in a different direction, and say, fine, that's a surge, it's going to cost you X amount of money in addition. So I think the contracting aspect of it too, when you have a number of non-FTE who are doing contracting development, or programming development, is another key component and a challenge. But absolutely, agility, Agile development is a key component. Thank you.
I yield back the time I don't have, and thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to thank the gentleman